figure that's higher.
The protests started small but escalated quickly. Social media can have that effect. Then came the security crackdown across Iraq, including the use of live ammunition. More than 100 protesters have been killed, as many as 6,000 wounded, and a number of news outlets have been attacked. Since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003, journalists have usually attributed unrest on the streets of Iraq to sectarianism, the divide between primarily Shia and Sunni Muslims. They can't do that this time. Iraqi protesters are demanding an overhaul of the political system, a system known as Muhassasa Ta'ifiyya, which has played on sectarian divides to carve up the spoils of war-torn but oil-rich Iraq so that most of the wealth gets circulated amongst the political elite and not nearly enough trickles down to ordinary Iraqis. That's what these demonstrations have been about. And given the scale of the protests, it's no wonder that politicians, the security forces they control, and the media outlets they own are closing ranks to protect the status quo. Our starting point this week is Baghdad. Why would Iraqi protesters out to change a political system that works for the few and not the many, protesters determined to have their movement covered, turn to a comedy program rather than a news broadcast to tell their story? Why would they send the videos they captured of the demonstrations and the deadly security response to the Al-Bashir Show, a comedy program airing on German broadcaster Deutsche Welle's Arabic service, and not, for instance, to Al-Iraqiyya, their own publicly funded national broadcaster? They were not looking for comedy relief. They were looking for fair coverage of a story that is no laughing matter.
The Al-Bashir
Show is a platform for the Iraqi people. He is always addressing their concerns, and especially at a time when Iraqi channels have been prohibited from showing the reality of Iraq, from showing the protests. His coverage has been crucial.
He was dedicating that episode of Al-Bashir Show to footage from the protesters. That this time, instead of people listening to him, it was going to be Al-Bashir Show listening to the people on the street.
بس الشباب كان صوتهم أعلى من صوت الطلقات وأعلى من صوت انفجار قنابل الدخان وأعلى من كل الخضرائيين وقنواتهم الفضائية.
And his biggest criticism is, where is our media? Why are they showing cartoons? Why are they showing cooking shows? I mean, this is probably one of the biggest moments in post-2003 Iraq, and the mainstream media isn't really covering it. His point was, we don't have a free and fair media, mainstream media, in our country.
That was made evident by the coverage of the demonstrations. More than 100 have been killed, thousands more wounded, but from the outset, most mainstream media outlets in Iraq tried to ignore the story. Not just Al-Iraqiyya, privately owned channels as well. By day 2 of the protests, police were firing live ammunition into the crowds. Iraqi television reporters started covering the story, but in many cases, they downplayed it. On day 3 came the internet shutdown, affecting 75% of the country. Some news outlets based outside Baghdad that were covering the story would pay the price. On day 5, masked men converged on the Saudi-owned Al Arabiya and the Kurdistan-based NRT Arabic, among others, ransacking their buildings, sending the channels a clear message.
So shutting down the internet was effective in reducing the ability of the protesters to coordinate, but shutting down the TV stations was part of a media blackout. The Iraqi government was probably up to no good. Violence was going to erupt. The heavy-handed approach was going to become worse. And having live media coverage was not going to go down well.
And so what the militias and government were trying to do was completely isolate Iraq from the world. These channels were covering events daily and from every province, and that's why they were targeted, because they were trying to give people a voice to speak out.
Unlike most of the popular unrest in Iraq's post-war era, the issues at the core of these protests are not primarily sectarian. They are systemic, with sectarian undertones. Iraq is not a poor country. It just feels like one. Despite more than $100 billion a year worth of oil exports, roughly 20% of Iraqis still lack a safe water supply. Many blame a system known as Muhassasa Ta'ifiyya, which translates to sectarian apportionment and amounts to a form of ethno-sectarian balancing. Under Muhassasa, Iraqi coalition governments hand out ministerial and government positions according to the percentage of the population that is Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish. They apportion budgetary spending on that basis as well. And while that approach sounds demographically defensible, in practice it has resulted in endemic corruption and a failure of the country's oil wealth benefiting ordinary Iraqis.
We have political parties. What they have managed to do is make sure that they have the wherewithals, the tools, and the resources to keep winning elections. Those tools are the following. A, winning government office and the wealth that the government offices have, and using that to reward their supporters. You also need public opinion. These political parties have their own TV or newspaper or radio outlets, then broadcast their message, because that loyal base requires constant messaging in order to keep them activated and keep them voting for the next round of elections.
The Muhassasa system allows politicians it masks corruption in government, basically. There is no political will in Iraq for an independent media, because what an independent media will do is expose corruption on a grand scale. But it'll also give voice to marginalized groups in Iraq who haven't necessarily been given a platform that might call to question the current political system.
Throughout the country, Iraqis feel the political process doesn't represent their voice. They feel that the mainstream media doesn't really represent their voice. The conventional news channels are linked to political parties. Now, those political parties are facing an existential threat. These protests are saying down with the system and down with all of the parties, not one party, all of them. So, of course, they won't want to cover the extent of which these citizens of Iraq have grievances.
Until 2003 and the fall of Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi media landscape was barren, consisting of just one TV channel, 4 radio stations, and 5 newspapers, all state-controlled. Satellite dishes were illegal. As the country transitioned out of the Hussein era, dozens of new broadcast outlets went on the air that the US-led coalition authorities said would safeguard the country's new democracy. All it took to acquire a license to broadcast was the money to buy one. But very few Iraqis could afford one. Those who could tended to come with political connections. A decade and a half later, what has resulted is a new landscape. Politically partisan proprietors and channels more devoted to their owners' interests than those of their viewers.
Because it's partisan, if there is a problem that doesn't have a partisan nature, then the system fails, kind of doesn't know how to handle it. Unlike previous protests against sectarian political parties, which, these media outlets are made and designed to cover, because you can just take sides. This is the protest of a majority Shia youth against a majority Shia-led government. So they didn't know what to do, so they decided just not to cover it. So in a way, the system failed, like system error.
Which explains why, when Iraqis took to the streets, they bypassed their own domestic media outlets and looked for help elsewhere. Is there any wonder that young Iraqis, when they chose to send their videos out for the world to see, that they chose a comedian working for a German broadcaster broadcasting in Arabic, as opposed to sending those videos to Iraqi journalists at Iraqi television channels?
It's not surprising at all, actually. The Iraqis have seen how politically affiliated their media are. And as they don't want to be associated with any particular side at the moment, these protesters are very keen to get across the fact they have no political affiliations. Ahmed al-Bashir, who's Iraqi, and Deutsche Welle, who are an independent international station, are the best option.